All right, so today we're going to talk about anaerobic cellular respiration and fermentation. But before we begin that, let's review. So in this section, we're learning about cellular respiration, which is the process that takes chemical energy stored in glucose and converts it into ATP energy, which can then be used to power our cells. So last time, we talked about aerobic cellular respiration. And remember, aerobic means that oxygen is required. And so in aerobic cellular respiration, there were 3 steps. So the first step was glycolysis. Then there was the Krebs cycle. And then finally, the electron transport chain. However, there are some organisms that thrive in environments with very little or no oxygen at all. And so these organisms, they still need to convert chemical energy into ATP energy. So instead of using the aerobic cellular respiration process, they are going to use a process called anaerobic cellular respiration. So anaerobic means that there's no oxygen used. And during the process of anaerobic cellular respiration, the organism's cells still go through these 3 steps, the glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. The only difference is that they use a different element instead of oxygen. So most likely they're going to use sulfate instead of oxygen as that electron acceptor. So when this happens, there's no more ATP that's made. We're just swapping out oxygen for sulfate. Or another option is the organism just sticks with glycolysis in a process called fermentation. So fermentation is an anaerobic pathway, and it only follows the stage of glycolysis. Okay. So since it's following the process of glycolysis, fermentation happens in the cytoplasm. And there are 2 main types of fermentation. So there's alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation, it occurs in yeast, in some single-celled organisms like bacteria when no oxygen is available. And lactic acid fermentation, it can happen in our muscles when we're like exercising really hard and there's not enough oxygen. And it can also happen in cheese and yogurt and ice cream and dairy products like that. All right, so let's recall glycolysis before we jump into fermentation. So during glycolysis, glucose is converted to 2 pyruvates, and 2 NAD plus molecules are converted to 2 NADH, and 2 ADP molecules are converted into 2 ATP molecules. So during alcoholic fermentation, we're going to start with those 2 pyruvates. And it's going to break down into something called acetaldehyde. And in this process, carbon dioxide is going to be given off. And the acetaldehyde becomes an electron acceptor, which means that it is going to help convert NADH back to NAD+. And through that process, we're going to get 2 ethyl alcohols. So now, this NAD+ can go back and be reused through the process of glycolysis again, and we can produce 2 ATP. The second type of fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation. So this time we take the pyruvate and we convert it to lactic acid. So let's draw this out. So we have the 2-pyruvate, and this is from the end of glycolysis. So we have those 2 pyruvates, and those will end up making 2 lactate molecules. And when this happens, the NADH is going to be converted to NAD+, which again, then this can go back through glycolysis again. Okay, and then we'll produce the 2 ATP molecules. So lactic acid fermentation, this happens in dairy, like our yogurts, our cheeses, our milks, our ice creams, but it also happens in our muscles. So when we are exercising really hard, and you can't get enough oxygen to supply what your muscles need, they can ferment, or we can get energy without oxygen. And then that produces lactic acid. So if you've ever heard of lactic acid buildup in your muscles, that is what's happening. And for a long time, it was thought this is what caused muscle soreness. However, new research says maybe it's not. So we're not sure about that. But we do know that when you exercise really hard and your muscles don't have enough oxygen, they do get their ATP energy through the anaerobic pathway of the lactic acid fermentation. All right, so here's a diagram that recaps cellular respiration. So regardless if it's aerobic or anaerobic, every organism is going to go through glycolysis, where we take glucose and it gets converted to pyruvate. If oxygen is present, then it's aerobic cellular respiration, and we move into the mitochondria and move on to the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. If no oxygen is present, then fermentation is going to occur, and either ethanol or lactate will be produced. So let's look at the energy tally between fermentation and aerobic respiration. So remember, in aerobic respiration, we get about 29 ATP. 2 come from glycolysis, 2 come from Krebs cycle, and then for this tally, I just said 25 ATP through electron transport. Remember, this can go as high as 34, but we never get the perfect amount. Okay, so we'll get about 25. So 29 total for aerobic cellular respiration versus only 2 ATP for anaerobic, because anaerobic is only using the process of glycolysis. Okay, so anaerobic definitely don't get as much bang for their buck. However, this is a process that has allowed them to grow and survive. And so even though they're not getting like 29 ATP molecules, they're still getting 2 ATP, and that has been enough for them to survive and grow. Not to mention, many of these anaerobes are still super important molecules that we need. For example, they help recycle carbon. All right, so then finally, I just want to kind of wrap things up for this entire chapter. So we focused on both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So both of these are important processes that cells are going to use to obtain energy. All right, so here in this diagram, we have the plant performing photosynthesis. So we need energy from the sun. And that's going to help produce glucose and oxygen. And then glucose and oxygen are needed in cellular respiration. From that, we get ATP energy, which allows our cells to perform their processes. And it gives off water and carbon dioxide, which again are needed as the reactants for photosynthesis. Here's another diagram between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. This one is maybe a little bit more in depth just between like the two different stages of photosynthesis. But again, we can see that in photosynthesis, we're going to produce oxygen and glucose. Okay, so that is going to go through glycolysis and produce ATP. And then that pyruvate continues through the Krebs cycle, which is going to produce more ATP, and continue through the electron transport system, which finally produces a bunch of ATP. It gives off water, which is needed in photosynthesis. Okay, so we can follow that cycle. And we can also see that from photosynthesis, it produces oxygen, which again can be used in the electron transport system. And then we can see how the NAD plus can carry electrons through the Krebs cycle, and then it'll produce CO2, which again can be used in photosynthesis.